So I wanted to just share with you in terms of the Kenyan Constitution and the promise for gender equality, and basically look at what we have within our Constitution, but also the reality of what has actually come about with regards to the gender-based reserved seats, but also in terms of the provisions that we have in the Constitution that protect and ensure that we balance not more than two-thirds of either gender are elected or appointed. So, in terms of the background, getting our 2010 constitution, we had a very violent election in 2007 that led to the necessity for people to come together and conclude the constitution making process that had taken over 20 years. And with that, we were able to promulgate our constitution, which really acknowledged the historical injustices that had been suffered. It acknowledged the aspirations of Kenyans, that we wanted to ensure that we had human rights, equality, freedom, social justice, and the rule of law. And with that, we came about with what we call our national values and principles of governance. And these bind all state officers, state organs, and public officers whenever they have to apply or interpret the Constitution, whenever they have to make any laws, and even interpret policy decisions. Now, within the national values and principles of governance, we recognize the centrality of equity, inclusiveness, equality, non-discrimination, amongst other values. So with that, there are various provisions within our constitution that are put in place to ensure that we address gender inequality that we have had over a number of years. The key one that really is very central to the discussion today is that we have a principle that says that not more than two-thirds of members of elective or appointed bodies shall be of the same gender. So that is clearly spelled out. And it is also spelled out that the state has to take legislative and other measures to ensure that they're able to address any past discrimination that has occurred. And so the Constitution has gone further to provide that when it comes to elections, not more than two-thirds of members of elective public bodies shall be of the same gender. And how it has put in place to bring this forth is having party lists that alternate between male and female candidates within our National Assembly, because we have a bicameral parliament. At the National Assembly, we have seats that have been set aside, 47 seats for women, whereby they are elected by registered voters from the counties. And at the Senate level, we also then have 16 seats that are set aside, are also then for women. And further then with trying to address the issue of youth representation, two members being either man, one being a man, the other being a woman, are then also elected to the Senate. And also the same applies for persons with disabilities. We also have a provision in our constitution that says that the parliament shall enact legislation that will go towards promoting the representation in parliament of women, persons with disability, youth, ethnic and other minorities, and marginalized communities. And what we've seen in terms of ensuring that we actualize the not more than two-thirds gender principle is that in the county assembly, there is a provision that if we have elections and we do not get the requisite not more than two-thirds, then there are special seats that are put aside to be able to top up that number to ensure that we actually then have the balance at the county assembly. So to give it some context, when the constitution was being formulated, this same provision, Article 177, did also apply for for Parliament. But unfortunately, during the negotiation process, this is one of the articles that was removed. So we do have the fundamental principle in the Constitution, but we do not have a mechanism for that within Parliament. Now, where we are at is that we have a constitution in Kenya, as you've seen, with very progressive principles, very progressive articles, but we have a constitution without constitutionalism. What do I mean here? Basically, that we have the foundation in the constitution, but there's been lack of political will to implement the not more than two-thirds gender principle. And even the article that I spoke about which is that Parliament will enact legislation to bring an increased participation of women. Throughout the years when we've been advocating to ensure that we actually actualize the not more than two-thirds gender principle, a lot of arguments have been made that if we have top-up provisions in Parliament to provide seats for the gender that is more often than not discriminated against, which is women, that this will be very expensive for the country to be able to manage having an expanded Parliament. But we've been able to buttress and we've been able to actually dispel that myth by undertaking a study whereby we showed that the cost of implementation would actually equalize what you would call the cost of a soft drink. And so being able to deconstruct some of those myths that were being propagated as to why we could not actualize the not more than two-thirds gender principle. Unfortunately, with the setting aside of seats for the women representatives, we've had a lot of stereotyping and misconceptions with regards to what those representatives were to do within Parliament and the County Assembly. There have been a lot of stereotyping and saying that the women who were taking up those seats were actually just what we would call flower girls, those who participate in a wedding, but they're not really part of the wedding. Very, disparaging language used against them, and big campaigns to actually remove those provisions from the Constitution. For the National Assembly women representatives, there've also been a lot of concerns about them not being able to have funds allocated to undertake the work that they have to do as regular National Assembly members do. But we were able to see that changed, and a funds allocation was put aside for them. But unfortunately, because we have women in the National Assembly, some who are elected and others who then have come through the process whereby they competed against men, there has been a lot of infighting in terms of those who are elected in seats that are not set aside for women, feeling that they're more entitled and that they have greater credibility within the National Assembly. So that has also really hampered the work that we've been doing around gender representation. So what has been the reality? In terms of the various positions, I hope you're able to see that we have had women who have stood for even the presidential position but have not been elected, the governor position but have not been elected. This is in the 2013 elections. And at the Senate, we were able to have 16 women senators nominated and a total of then 18 seats, because we were able to get the seat for the youth and the women for persons with disabilities that is set aside. In the county assembly, which is then further the most local level, we had 1,450 seats, but only 82 women were elected in 2013, meaning that we had to have 680 women nominated to be able to meet the threshold. So this just shows you the challenges that come about, that even when you have a provision in law, there's still a lot of barriers that then do not get you the actual numbers that you want to see come about. Let me now show you 2017, and you can see an improvement. We did have women elected directly as senators, 3 of them. We also then had an increase in the members of the National Assembly, 23 being elected out of 290. And also in the County Assembly, we did have an increase there in terms of the women who were elected. And that meant we had less women who had to be nominated. So in terms of the reality and the challenges, after the 2013 elections, which is the first election that we had with the promulgation of the new constitution, only 20% of the members of parliament were women, meaning that we had not met the not more than two-thirds gender principle. But this increased in 2017. We had 29% increase. And even in terms, sorry, we had an 18% increase in the number of women who were elected to office. And we had more women candidates competing in the 2017 elections. So what have been the challenges? Challenges that continue to exist and persist for women's political participation. They still remain in terms of the cultural barriers, financial barriers. Our elections in Kenya, the campaigning around it is very expensive. There's still a lot of political barriers as well. our political parties are extremely difficult spaces for women to be able to equally compete for the nomination process. So that is a key barrier to women's political participation. We do have a lot of gender stereotyping and stigma, which is prevalent and seen even in our media coverage of female political leaders. They would be covered from a point of, are they married? Do they have children? Is their husband aware that they're vying for political office? As opposed to the coverage that you will find for male political leaders, which doesn't go into their gender roles or even their marital status. Now, gender-based violence, unfortunately, around elections is still a big challenge that we have in Kenya, despite having a legal framework that does provide for punishment for those who undertake electoral violence. So there is a failure by agencies to implement laws around electoral violence. But there are some opportunities. I spoke about the law that calls for Parliament having to enact legislation that actually improves participation of marginalized groups. Now, in our constitution, a provision is there that if Parliament would not have done this within 5 years, that they could be dissolved. Parliament could be dissolved. And so there is an advisory that was given this year by our Chief Justice to the President, calling for the dissolution of Parliament because they have failed to enact legislation around the Article 100. Currently in Kenya, we're going through a lot of law reform processes. Unfortunately, there's a very strong push to amend our constitution. And one of the things that they want to amend is how do we actualize the not more than two-thirds gender principle. So even though there are other aspects they want to amend that people are concerned about, that is one of the things that has been put on the table to ensure that we do have not more than two-thirds within parliament. But there are concerns about how this is going to shape out because of the political nature of the constitution reform process that we're in. We have been able to use a lot of alternative media to get the message across in terms of raising public awareness that women can be leaders, because we felt that we needed to be able to change the mindset of Kenyans, that women can be political leaders and they would make good political leaders regardless of the stereotypes that have been there in the past. So
Grace?
use of social media, being able to profile women as competent leaders, and also deconstructing the ideology that women have to meet a higher standard and a higher threshold compared to their male counterparts. Also,
Grace,
in terms of, sorry,
um, if you could wind up in a bit. Your,
yes, just this is actually my last slide.
thank you.
We've also been able to undertake quite a bit of capacity building for women who have been interested vying for political office and helping them to network so that we could have increased number of women who are vying for elective office. So in a nutshell, what we have is that a constitution that has a very progressive framework, being able to ensure that we address gender inequality, which has been a fundamental problem in Kenya, but a lack of political will to take us over the thresholds to actualize this. And so it's still an uphill task. And what we focus on is how can we entrench constitutionalism in Kenya, apart from just having the constitution that is very progressive. Thank you very much.